hasn't been a matter of if this was going to happen. It's always been a matter of when. Many folks are preparing for the potential civil unrest that has been seen in the past as a result of widespread food shortages. Experts are warning that even if you are well-fed, prepped, and your pantry is stocked to the rafters, that rising food costs in the country will impact you too. And time is running out to prepare for what is predicted to happen in the coming months, as we're in a global food crisis that will wreak havoc on local economies and trigger civil unrest and potentially deadly consequences. And Michael Burry, best known for predicting the 2008 housing market collapse and making a killing in the process, who was also the hedge fund manager depicted by Christian Bale in the movie The Big Short, has been aggressively investing during this market downturn, which begs the question of, should we be following in his footsteps? I mean, even one of the greatest investors of all time, wealthy old man and owner of Berkshire Hathaway's BNSF railroad division, Warren Buffett said, "Be greedy when others are fearful." But perhaps we have witnessed a little too much of this corporate greed, and we should all be preparing for the possibility of a national strike as U.S. railroad workers for Union Pacific, CSX, Norfolk Southern, Kansas City Southern, and Warren Buffett's BNSF inch closer to a strike and a massive shutdown of our supply chain and a total wipeout of our economy. At the same time, we're witnessing a global food crisis unfolding, spurred by the invasion of Ukraine and what some would classify as climate events. Oh, and mass layoffs across several industries as a result of inflation, higher operating and overhead costs, market declines, and poor leadership from our elected officials. I hope you have those stimulus checks stashed away, just like Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said, as he called out Americans for being flush with cash in their checking and savings accounts from the stimulus check payments that went out 2 years ago. It's time to hang on because we are in for a bumpy ride. So Michael Burry predicted higher long-term inflation in the U.S., fueled by a shift towards more domestic production, a post-pandemic shakeup of global supply chains, and a chronic shortage of manual workers. And so far, he's been spot on. Burry's latest 13F filing for the first quarter of 2022 shows a broad range of new investments and some interesting strategic moves with options trading. Now, I hope he isn't getting involved in any of the insider trading deals after chatting it up with Nancy Pelosi and her husband as they invested to see potential gains worth millions of dollars in the tech sector by investing in call options tied to NVIDIA, a company that produces and specializes in computer graphics related cards, chips, and other peripherals. But that's a significant shift from the previous quarter when Burry was selling most of his stock portfolio and calling for the mother of all crashes. I'm going to keep my eye on him. But speaking of profit, the U.S.-based Norfolk Southern Railroad Company has reported a growth in revenue in the second quarter of this year despite network fluidity hurdles. In the 3-month period that ended June 30th, 2022, the firm's railway operating revenues reached an all-time quarterly record at $3.25 billion. This is a 16% increase in revenue compared with $2.78 billion in the same period last year. The railroad firm reported a 21% increase in operating expenses to nearly $2 billion after being hit by inflation and higher fuel costs, amongst other things. Norfolk Southern President and CEO Alan Shaw said they remain steadfast in their commitment to service recovery. In the quarter, they made considerable progress on staffing and launched our TOP SPG operating model, both of which are foundational to achieving our targeted service levels and long-term growth strategy. Now, this is not to be confused with PSR, or precision scheduled railroading, which prevents railroad workers, engineers, and conductors from utilizing adequate and reasonable time off for events such as doctors and dentist appointments, or even attending a funeral for a spouse without negative consequences and points deductions, which can negatively affect and impact pay, earnings, employment, and retirement benefits. Norfolk Southern's TOP SPG stands for Thoroughbred operating plan, and it modifies about 90% of scheduled intermodal and merchandise trains to reduce terminal congestion, improve network fluidity, and create capacity for growth, ultimately by simplifying the network through an operating plan with a high level of executability that will drive greater consistency and service improvements for customers. Norfolk Southern stated that they are already seeing visible upticks in qualified employees and train speeds as a result of these initiatives, and they expect to see further progress on service recovery in the months ahead. Now, perhaps Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway Railroad Company, BNSF, could learn a thing or two from Norfolk Southern. After widespread complaints from railroad workers sparked the need for President Joe Biden to step in and appoint an emergency board to help resolve the labor dispute after rail workers from several train companies, including BNSF, warned they have the ability to stop the trains from moving. And stopping the trains from moving could cause major problems for pretty much everyone in the United States. With a recent boots on the ground urgent intel report being shared on a recent upload by Preparing for Survival, stating that an individual that works for a railroad company warned us all that the Class 1 railroads are going to go on strike soon. And he said this is because the workers have been going without a contract since 2019. And there have been no pay raises, no healthier or safer work environment changes, while railroad workers have had to deal with the pandemic in 2020 and 2021 and huge inflation thereafter. He added that the railroad companies have offered their workers a 16% pay raise, but that is far off from the demands of the 12 railroad unions that are wanting a 36% pay raise. And he said that he personally cannot blame them. But since the railroad company and the workers cannot reach an agreement, he warned us to expect a strike coming once the cooling off period expires. And this would mean no rail traffic moving, no shipping containers moving, no fuel moving, no lumber or building materials moving, no chemical materials to make paper and plastic moving either. Everything would be shut down, and we would then begin to see our store shelves completely wiped out. He also warned that after that, Class 2 and Class 3 railroads would be shut down, meaning your short lines will suffer, and then other industries will suffer as a result. Now, this is not good, and I really hope this doesn't happen. He warned that this will be 10 times worse than the trucker strike of the 1970s, and it will also be the first time in 2 centuries that a railroad strike this bad would have happened. Now, this is a clear sign to prepare for SHTF if there ever was one. He said, included in the Class 1 railroads are CSX, Union Pacific, BNSF, Norfolk Southern, Canadian National, Kansas City Southern, and Canadian Pacific. And he restated again that when all 7 of these Class 1s go on strike, the Class 2 and Class 3 railroads won't be moving traffic either. And there's not enough trucks to move the traffic commodities as the railroaders typically move. And can you believe that this is how these multi-billion-dollar companies treat their employees, their most valuable assets? Without the railroad workers, these trains don't move. The freight doesn't move. No revenue or profits get made. Well, that is at least until they replace these hardworking people with AI-based, autonomous, self-driving train conductor technology. Meanwhile, Union Pacific's second quarter profit improved, and the Omaha, Nebraska-based Union Pacific Rail said that its second quarter profits improved and grew to $1.84 billion, or $2.93 per share in the second quarter. That's up a substantial amount from last year, while beating Wall Street expectations and battling the soaring price of diesel, which also weighed on the results, although fuel surcharges and rate increases helped to offset that. Union Pacific said it has added 486 new train crew members so far this year to help move its trains, and it has another 504 in training. The railroad said it is on track to hire about 1,400 people this year, but hiring has been difficult amid ongoing worker shortages and news spreading that working conditions on the railroads aren't quite as good as they could be. Inversely, businesses that rely on the railroads to deliver the raw materials they need and their finished products have been complaining for months about delays along Union Pacific and other major freight railroads. At times, some companies have had to reduce production because they were waiting for trains. At the time of recording this video, the railroads hope to reach a contract agreement with their 12 unions now that President Joe Biden has appointed a board of arbitrators to intervene in the deadlocked talks. A new contract could help with hiring because employees will get raises. This would be a step in the right direction as agricultural leaders' fears are growing with a looming threat of railroad workers preparing to go on strike. AG leaders hope railroads and unions can avert a national strike before September 15th. Mike Steenhoek is with the U.S. Soy Transportation Coalition, and he said having a work stoppage, whether it's temporary or certainly lengthy, would be very hurtful at this time of the year and at this juncture. We encourage both parties to come to a resolution that benefits both sides. We think that that's definitely possible. And Tom Bresner with the Wisconsin Agribusiness Association says a railroad strike would have a big impact on agriculture, starting with Western livestock operations. All the large dairy and cattle operations in California and Arizona, all of that corn is moved out generally from Nebraska, Kansas, and Iowa. A railroad shutdown would be a devastating blow to farming and our overall food supply. Bresner said it's not just agriculture that would be affected, since rail accounts for about 30% of all transportation, and shifting to more trucks is just not a viable option. Short-haul freight and box trucks are great, but not nearly as efficient on the long haul if you can put it on a train. So it's going to add tremendous cost, even if you can get the trucks in the first place, which is highly unlikely. Steenhoek says President Biden appointed a 3-person presidential emergency board on July 18th to work with the railroads and the unions to come up with a proposal by mid-August. Then the two sides have until September 15th to accept or reject the board's proposal. At that point, the unions can vote to strike, and owners can have lockouts if they choose unless Congress intervenes. So we will be anxiously awaiting to see where negotiations are in the next 2 weeks. Bresner says the real key now is to get both sides to sit down and try to avert a strike to keep the transportation system working. 10 labor unions are negotiating as a coalition, and 2 other unions are negotiating as a separate coalition. And the issues include health benefits, pay raises retroactive to 2020, minimum train crew sizes, work rules, and vacation time. Now, I'm hoping for an amicable resolution since reports shared by Business Insider state that we're in a global food crisis that will wreak havoc on local economies and trigger civil unrest. And a train railroad shutdown will only further contribute to our food supply being completely wiped out. A global food crisis is unfolding, spurred by the Ukraine invasion and climate events. And history has shown that food shortages have led to civil unrest in the past with deadly consequences. Experts warn that even if you're well-fed, rising food costs in the country will impact you. And I hope everyone is doing all they can to prepare their family for this. I'm predicting that this winter is going to be very tough for all of us, but most harsh for those who have ignored the warning signs and haven't taken action to prepare. For example, in India, the cost of lemons has skyrocketed. Rice has become so expensive in Nigeria that people are skipping meals. In Mexico, avocado prices have jumped, making them a luxury very few can afford. Orange groves in Florida are yielding the lowest amount of fruit in years. And in Japan, a shortage of salmon is hitting the sushi trade. Now, this is real stuff, folks, and it'll make its way here to America in your Costco, Sam's Club, Walmart, Kroger, Aldi, Sprouts, Publix, Lidl. None of them will be safe. I can honestly see more empty shelves coming this winter and much higher prices and limited supply and high demand continuing to drive inflation and price gouging. If you take a moment and zoom out, it's pretty clear. A food crisis is unfolding around the world with prices shooting up everywhere. And when that happens, everyone feels the pain. People can cut back on movies or even driving when the cost of tickets or gas surges, but everyone needs to eat. It's a fact. Experts warn that even if you're well-fed, rising food costs in the country will impact you. The crisis, a long time in the making, but brought to a head by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is already having profound effects. In Peru, protests against a jump in food and fuel costs turned deadly in April. Sri Lanka's government collapsed and its president was ousted in July as people took to the streets to demonstrate against the scarcity of food, fuel, and medicine. Now, can you imagine that happening here in America, in your town, on your streets? Unless urgent action is taken, experts warn that the crisis could have dire global consequences, where in some countries, changes in the availability of food might alter age-old recipes and customs. Civil unrest could spread, fueling instability and even war in some of the world's poorest regions. A breakdown in food systems could drive huge waves of migration. And where do you think these immigrants, aliens, and refugees are going to flock to? That's right, you guessed it. Economists are just in their statements of a food crisis is a price crisis. Implications are widespread and touch every person's life, even if they don't immediately realize it, which I think a lot of people haven't and are possibly in denial. Warnings from global organizations are growing louder and more desperate. And according to the UN World Food Program, 50 million people around the world are on the brink of famine and risk being tipped over because of the looming hunger catastrophe. Global food prices have surged following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in late February. U.S. prices jumped 10% year over year as of May. That was the biggest increase since 1981. And globally, things are even worse. The UN's World Food Price Index shot up 23% year over year as of June. And to put it simply, more and more people are struggling to afford food. And we're really witnessing a bunch of crises coming together all at one time. If you worry about domestic policies, if you worry about environmental matters, if you worry about immigration matters, if you worry about diplomacy and the military, you should be paying attention to the food crisis too, because it is lurking in the background and pushing those things. Russian President Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine was a considerable force that helped push the global food system to its breaking point. According to the World Food Program, before the war, Russia and Ukraine together accounted for 30% of globally traded wheat, 20% of maize, and 70% of sunflower supplies. The war hasn't just laid waste to farms, but Putin's troops have blockaded Ukraine's Black Sea coast, stopping vital agricultural products from leaving the country. Meanwhile, the conflict and the resulting Western sanctions on Russia have sent energy costs shooting up, with oil prices up more than 40% this year, which in turn drives up the cost of fertilizer. Wayne Gordon, a senior commodity strategist at UBS, told Business Insider that this issue could be easily prolonged into next year. Because if you're a Ukrainian producer and your domestic prices, let's just say, half of what it is on a global basis, your incentive or your ability to plant the next crop has been significantly reduced due to poor margins, as you are still paying high prices for inputs. Although the Ukraine war sparked this crisis, other factors have been bubbling for a long time. Climate change, the pandemic, and the rising number of conflicts around the world have piled pressure on the global food system in recent years. Greenhouse gas emissions have sparked unpredictable weather patterns, and a UN report from last year found that by the end of the century, as much as 30% of current farmland could become unsuitable to grow crops. Think drought in the western and southern parts of the United States, and heavy rains and flooding in the eastern half of the country, washing out harvests and putting crops and farmland underwater. The food service has faced two successive crises, which include the pandemic and inflation, which have not only significantly reduced turnover, but are also creating a new round of over-indebtedness for the majority of businesses in the sector, with nearly 44% telling a sector survey they have no cash at all. Now, do you remember the business bankruptcies that I warned you about in my previous videos? It's time to get ready. These businesses are not flush with cash and are basically broke and holding on by a thread, while dealing with another crisis, that of the lack of workers, as 78.6% of businesses face staff shortage problems or are forced to lay off their workforce as business declines. Overhead operating costs continue to increase, consumer spending is down, and their credit lines are reduced by banks and lenders. Just recently reported, a major U.S. metal manufacturer in the U.S. announced earlier this week a new round of layoffs set to begin next month. In a letter to the Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development, Neenan Foundry, a manufacturer and provider of highly engineered structural and sustainable solutions for a variety of infrastructure and industrial end market customers, said that it is planning to lay off a significant amount of its employees and workforce labor. At least 115 employees, starting as soon as September 27th, will be out of a job, and probably at a worse time than ever, and in a small town that probably was the backbone of the community's economy and a lifeline to several families. The letter said employees who will be affected by this layoff include both production workers who are members of the United Steelworkers Union and its affiliated Local 121B, and non-union employees as well. And the remaining employees who may be affected by the layoff are non-union workers who do not have any bidding, bumping, or transfer rights. But the company is providing notice to those affected non-union employees too. The announcement announcement by Neenah Foundry comes as several other big companies across the nation have made similar moves, letting go of more employees as some businesses are just becoming too difficult to operate and maintain profitability with all the hurdles they face, like inflation, rising interest rates, supply chain shortages, possible higher taxes, and a potential railroad strike that could cut off their raw material supply line. The company is the largest independent foundry in the U.S. and produces gray and ductile iron castings. Neenah Foundry's most recognizable products include manhole covers and frames, inlet frames and grates, tree grates, and cast iron trench grates in roads and airport runways across America and internationally. The move to lay off over 100 employees comes shortly after Neenah announced that it was selling its market of trucks. And you may recall a previous video uploaded to this channel that earlier this year in June, Century Aluminum in Kentucky announced that it was planning to lay off 628 of its employees, releasing a statement that explained, as a result of an unfortunate and an unprecedented rise in global energy prices arising from the Russian war in Ukraine that has dramatically increased the price of energy in the U.S. and around the globe. The company said, the cost required to run our Hallsville, Kentucky facility has more than tripled the historic average in a very short period. And given these circumstances, it is necessary to fully curtail operations for a period of approximately 9 to 12 months at Hallsville until energy prices return to more normalized levels. Now, we talked about this in previous videos, and I predicted these events would happen just a few short weeks ago. Go back and watch my previous videos and you'll see. Originally, when there were announcements of a possible diesel fuel shortage as we rolled into summer and summer travel, if you recall, I discussed all the emergency response vehicles such as ambulance, fire, and police that would be crippled by a diesel fuel shortage, as well as a pileup of trash, as sanitation services trucks would be stranded if their tanks were unable to be filled with the required diesel fuels. Well, it looks like we may have dodged that bullet, but the prediction for business failing and seeing financial hardship and ultimately bankruptcy appears to be spot on. Warrior Disposal tells customers it's filing for bankruptcy and trash pickup to stop immediately. This is after the trash haulers' pickups were delayed by weeks for several customers. The owner blamed staff shortages for the delays in trash pickup, but the owner told customers they are filing for bankruptcy and that their already delayed pickups would never be happening. Ouch. Warrior Disposal owners told customers in an email that there are things out of our control and we've been fighting these situations for years and it's taken a toll on our family and our finances. One of the most critical things is finding people who are available, willing, and want to work. We've been talking to lawyers about our situation and we have no choice but to file for bankruptcy at this time. They wrote further down in the email, we will not be able to continue with picking up trash and this will take place immediately. The company's website has since been taken down and text messages and phone calls to the owners have not been returned. It's all starting to slowly fall apart, everybody. And get this, the email message made no mention of refunds to customers or how to return their trash and recycling bins beyond asking customers not to drop them at the addresses that may have been published on their social media websites. The waste disposal company said in an email to customers that we do not own the yard where we are parked and the house you keep vandalizing is not our place of residence. It is clear the civil unrest has begun. Warrior Disposal started up in 2019 and touted itself as veteran-owned, something customers said had attracted them to the company in the first place. Joseph Gonzalez, who owns the company, with his Navy veteran wife, told local news reporters that Warrior had nearly 5,000 customers, but it was down to just 3 employees out in the field from a high of 16, and they just couldn't manage it anymore. But wait, there's more. Robinhood is cutting about 23% of its jobs after it releases second quarter earnings reports, which showed a decline in monthly active users and assets under custody. Layoffs will be primarily in operations, marketing, and program management as the company blamed deterioration of the macro environment with inflation at a 40-year high accompanied by a broad crypto market crash. This comes after Robinhood just got done laying off 9% of its workforce in April. The company press release said the brokerage app firm would flatten its organizational structure to give new general managers broad responsibilities for its businesses. To me, that sounds like a nice way of saying more work, longer hours, more responsibility, and less pay. And they also said that affected employees would receive an email and a Slack message letting them know if they were being let go or if they still had a job. And the crypto market is starting to show its true self more and more. Celsius Network, once a titan of the crypto lending world, is in bankruptcy proceedings and facing down claims that it was running a Ponzi scheme by paying early depositors with the money it got from new users. Some of the 1.7 million customers left holding the bag, and some completely wiped out by the alleged fraud, are now directly pleading with the Southern District of New York to help them get their money back. One cryptocurrency investor, a 37-year-old living in Connecticut, wrote in a letter included in court exhibits that he trusted Celsius with his retirement savings and has lost more than $30,000, which has brought him into unsurmountable tax complications. The question of who gets paid first, should that day ever come, looms heavy over the bankruptcy proceedings. At its peak in October of last year, Celsius CEO Alex Mashinsky said the crypto lender had $25 billion in assets under management. Now, Celsius is down to just $167 million in cash on hand, which it says will provide ample liquidity to support operations during the restructuring process. But Celsius still owes its users around $4.7 billion, according to the bankruptcy filing. That filing also shows that Celsius had more than 100,000 creditors, some of whom lent the platform cash without any collateral to back up the arrangement. And that's just not smart. And the list of its top 50 unsecured creditors includes Sam Bankman-Fried trading from Alameda Research, as well as an investment firm based in the Cayman Islands. Those creditors are likely first in line to get their money back, leaving small retail investors holding the bag and feeling the most pain. Unlike the traditional banking system, which typically ensures customer deposits, there aren't formal consumer protections in place to safeguard user funds when things go wrong. Celsius spells it out in their terms and conditions that any digital asset transferred to the platform constitutes a loan from the user to Celsius, and because there was no collateral put up by Celsius, customers' funds were essentially just unsecured loans to the platform. Now guys, you gotta pay attention, especially when investing in uncharted territory and markets as volatile as cryptocurrency. Also in the fine print of Celsius terms and conditions is a warning that in the event of a bankruptcy, any eligible digital assets used in the earn service or as collateral under the borrow service may not be recoverable, and that customers may not have any legal remedies or rights in connection with Celsius's obligations. This disclosure reads like an attempt at a blanket immunity from legal wrongdoing should things ever go south, which I'm sure they expected to occur and anticipated. In the hundreds of letters officially submitted to the court, retail investors begged to be put at the front of the line and get their money back. A single mother of 2 college-bound daughters said her family has been severely impacted both in financial and mental health by the bankruptcy, which has left her funds stranded on the platform. The single mother investor, who also supports her parents, said she can't sleep or focus at work. She wrote, "I'm struggling hard to make a living." Another investor, who described herself as a little retired old lady living on a fixed income, said she turned to Celsius in search of a way to supplement her monthly Social Security check to stretch her dollar amid record levels of inflation. She said, "I purchased my small amount of crypto, hoping just to earn enough to help me weather a few years, kind of a safety net. Others have lost everything." A California resident said he has less than $1,000 in his Wells Fargo checking account, now his only source of funds to provide for his family since Celsius suspended all his withdrawals. He told the judge who is overseeing the Celsius bankruptcy proceedings in New York, "There's absolutely no way that I can continue to provide without access to my assets at Celsius," and added, "This is an emergency situation, simply to keep a roof over my family and food on their table." Sean Moran of Dublin wrote that he lost a family farm in Ireland and his family is now homeless. Sean said he can't believe that they lied to us on the weekly AMA Ask Me Anything events about not trusting banks, whilst all along they were wolves in sheep's clothing, false promises and misleading information. Moran wrote, "I'm mentally unstable. Family are distraught with my decisions of trusting Celsius and promising them a better future." And I can believe it. Do you guys remember the video I uploaded when driving through Wyoming and discussing the predicted rise in mental health battles as so many people approach the edge and dangerously dance on the verge of being completely wiped out financially? Many families will perish. If you haven't already, Tell your family to prepare. Beyond the financial devastation described in each of these letters, one recurring theme centers around a sense of betrayal over the breach of trust between Celsius CEO Alex Mashinsky and his customers. 3 weeks after Celsius halted withdrawals due to extreme market conditions, and a few days before the crypto lender ultimately filed for bankruptcy protection, the platform was still advertising in big, bold text on its website annual returns of nearly 19%, which paid out weekly. What a scam. They sold these folks a bill of goods. Many investors said they were fooled by the marketing. Transfer your crypto to Celsius and you could be earning up to 18.63 APY in minutes, which is what the website read on July 3rd. One investor said, I believed in all the commercials, social media, and advertising that showed Celsius was a high-yield, low-risk savings account. We were ensured that our funds are safer at Celsius than in a bank. This money is pretty much my life savings. I hope you can find it the best interest of all parties involved to pay back the smaller investors first before any restructuring occurs. These are tough stories to listen to, guys. Travis Rogers of Phoenix said that he was told on numerous phone calls to Celsius Network as recently as 2 days before it locked depositors' accounts that there was no danger to client assets and zero probability of bankruptcy. Rogers said he recorded several of these calls. He said his Celsius holdings totaled $40,000 across 11 cryptocurrencies. The weekly Ask Me Anything events hosted by Mashinsky on YouTube were mentioned in multiple letters, including one sent in by Stephen Richardson, who itemized the many ways in which he feels Mashinsky deceived the public in order to lure new customers into the scheme. Richardson, investor, said Alex would talk about how Celsius is safer than banks because they supposedly don't rehypothecate and use fractional reserve lending like the banks do. This investor, who lost lots of his hard-earned money, said, I currently have 6 figures worth of crypto locked in my Celsius account, unable to be withdrawn, despite Alex's claims mere hours before withdrawals were closed that nobody has any issue withdrawing from Celsius and that everything you hear to the contrary is simply FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. What a snake. Some said they have even contemplated suicide if they can't retrieve their funds. Katie Davis of Australia pleaded with the judge for the return of the $138,000 she and her husband have stranded on the Celsius platform. Davis said, the thought of losing that amount of money is horrifying, stating that if I do not get that back, I will end my life as the loss will impact my family and I significantly. Now, money can be replaced, but your life, well, you only have one to live, and your family will need you more than any amount of money. I want you all to be safe, careful, and smart with your finances and possible investments. I only invest the amounts of money I'm willing to lose. You just never know. Anything can happen. Having great diversification and knowledge has always served me well. I wish you all the best, and I'll bring you another update as soon as I can. Take care. See you guys soon.